Preaching, a word that means the giving of moral advice in a pompously self-righteous way. The Russia-Ukraine war that began in February has divided the world in many ways. What happens when nations begin preaching to one another, especially amid a war, bullying others into taking sides? Does it really isolate countries that refuse to toe the line in its truest sense? What repercussions does it really have? Or are certain narratives a creation of a segment of influential lobbies, their mouthpieces in the media, and foreign policy analysts that seldom have an impact on global affairs? Hello and namaste. I am Richa Dwivedi and this is The Bottom Line. Months on, the war between Russia and Ukraine is still on. With powers aligning to isolate Russia, the war has exposed the hypocrisy of Western lobbies in furthering narratives with respect to various nations, particularly India. But do countries and their governments have the right to decide for their people? Take a look at these headlines. If we take it at face value, it would seem that India is on the wrong side of history, that India has no right to decide for itself, and that India is a state that needs to pick sides to win the appreciation of Western nations. But as these media outlets peddled their opinions as that of their governments, the officials of their countries have been lining up in New Delhi to boost bilateral ties. In the last month, several high-level engagements took place with Japan's Prime Minister, Nepal's Prime Minister, Russian Foreign Minister, meeting Prime Minister Narendra Modi, while Mexico's Foreign Minister met with Dr. S. Jaishankar in New Delhi. Australia inked a free trade pact with India. Does this mean they were engaging with India while simultaneously opposing its stand on the Russia-Ukraine crisis? There's been greater pragmatism demonstrated by the governments of these countries, unlike their influential lobbies. The fact that both Russia and Ukraine spoke to New Delhi almost immediately after the war broke out shows the perception of India by opposing parties as one who takes an appropriate stand. Before we move further, we must understand why India has ordered oil from Russia. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Indian economy could be in for a major shock if crude oil remains above $80 a barrel for months. This would lead to inflation, thereby hurting India's post-pandemic economic recovery. Therefore, the decision to buy oil from Russia is of serving the national interest. Recently, in the 2+2 talks in the US, India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar's sharp retort to a foreign journalist questioning India's energy purchase from Russia dispelled the notion that India is doing nothing extraordinary.
Oil purchases. If you are looking at energy purchases from Russia, I would suggest that your attention should be focused on Europe, which probably we do buy some energy which is necessary for our energy security. But I suspect, looking at the figures, probably our total purchases for the month would be less than what Europe does in an afternoon. So you might want to think about it.
We have seen in the recent past how the likes of New York Times, Guardian et al. Had covered India's COVID crisis. If we compare it with their coverage of Western nations, it becomes amply clear why they resorted to their motivated narratives. But again, responsibility has not exactly been their forte, so let's move on. The sanctions imposed on Russia owing to its attack on Ukraine raised several questions. What will happen to the supply chains?
Russia exports 5 million barrels of crude oil each day, primarily to Europe, US and China.
So what happens to that? Turns out, as Western media, think tanks, and analysts kept sermonizing India, criticizing its purchase of oil at discounted rates from Russia,
The European Union alone has made payments amounting to over 37 billion euros to Russia for oil, gas, and coal. This is over 40 billion US dollars in payments after the conflict began. Germany relies on Russia for nearly 32% of its gas supply. The US was paying Russia close to 70 million US dollars every day for energy imports well into March, and that's not all. The USA increased its oil imports from Russia by 43% as late as April 3rd. In fact, some reports suggest that the European Union, the UK, and the US alone account for around 300 billion US dollars in Russian energy imports, and these countries may actually help Russia meet its import targets even this year. That's not all. China is the world's top importer of Russian crude oil, buying an average of 1.59 million barrels per day last year. It also bought 16.5 billion cubic meters of gas from Russia last year. By contrast, in 2021, India purchased about 12 million barrels from Russia, making up only 2% of its total imports. India's annual oil imports look something like this.
have stopped looking after their interests? Clearly not. On the contrary, Western nations have always prioritized their interests, and there's nothing wrong with it. Historically, when the war broke out in Syria, the US was funding the Al-Nusra faction of Al-Qaeda in order to overthrow the Assad regime. This is where Russia intervened with its airstrikes. Both nations were serving their own national interests here. Similarly, in Afghanistan, the US dumped the country into the hands of the Taliban and left completely disregarding the security concerns of its neighboring countries. Turns out, now the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan has been wreaking havoc in parts of Pakistan that itself runs terror factories. In the near future, if the Taliban spillover reaches India's doorstep, who is to be held responsible? But it was in their national interest to leave after a 20-year-long war, so they did. Historically, India has tried to maintain a neutral position, especially with the world having been divided into ideological blocs. But one fundamental problem with India's stand that we do not see anymore was its moral preaching and undermining of its own national interests at the cost of others. The biggest example of this is when India had advocated for China's inclusion in the United Nations Security Council while engaging in moral lectures at world events. But today, India is looking out for its own interests first. This has been the principle. In 2021, Prime Minister Modi asserted reforms in the United Nations and a greater role for India on the world stage.
आज विश्व का हर छठा व्यक्ति भारतीय है। जब भारतीयों की प्रगति होती है, तो विश्व के विकास को भी गति मिलती है। When India grows, the world grows.
India has maintained a neutral ground, keeping its national interests above everything else. India has been firm in its dealings with nations across the globe. Then why is it that Western media, foreign policy analysts, think tanks and minor players in foreign governments have taken a stance that condemns India but turns a blind eye towards their own countries?
In 2020, India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar referred to the West using Goldilocks principle on India and mentioned how India wanted to be viewed by the world.
It is what I would call a sort of a Goldilocks era of our relationship, which is the West didn't want India to get too weak, it didn't want India to get too strong. So it stirred the Indian porridge, or tried to stir the Indian porridge just right. And sometimes, got it, say there were margins of error on either side. So you actually have a very interesting sort of situation where when India in 1962, after the conflict where we were defeated, actually the West comes to the assistance of India. But in less than a decade, in 1971, when it seems to the West that India is seeking a primacy in the subcontinent, the West opposes India. So there's a sort of a bandwidth in which the relationship operates. Now this bandwidth is not just episodic. I mean, if you look, where is it that we got our relationship right and where is it we did not? pretty much across the development spectrum, the West was very supportive. But when it came to industrialization, particularly in heavy industries, or when it came to defense and security, the West was very conservative.
Signs of India's evolving foreign policy could be seen as early as 2018 when Prime Minister Modi, while addressing Bharat Ki Baat Sabke Saath in London, had asserted how India will engage with all the nations.
हिंदुस्तान में दम होना चाहिए कि हिंदुस्तान डंके की चोट पर कहे कि जब मुझे इजराइल जाना है मैं सीधा इजराइल जाऊंगा और जिस दिन मुझे पैलेस्टाइन जाना होगा उस दिन हिम्मत के साथ मैं पैलेस्टाइन जाऊंगा। मैं सऊदी अरेबिया भी जाऊंगा, उतने ही प्यार से उनका सर्वश्रेष्ठ सम्मान भी प्राप्त करूंगा और देश की एनर्जी सिक्योरिटी के लिए जरूरत है तो मैं ईरान भी जाऊंगा।
But of course, there have been some sermonizing statements by officials of the White House. When you hear Press Secretary Jen Psaki or NSA Dileep Singh talking down India for not being on the right side of history, you have to understand that this consensus has been built by the think tank lobby of Washington DC, which has guided US foreign policy for more than 7 decades, often in the wrong direction. The 2003 Iraq invasion was premised on the false narrative that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, when eventually nothing was found. The compadres in the supposedly liberal media have furthered their narratives. Perhaps it is not as important to pay attention to everything that they say, but that is important to take note of the recognition of the weight of India in global affairs and how it is presenting an alternative approach. India is looking after its own interests. Contrary to the various lobbies, this positioning has compelled many countries to engage with India on an even footing. India has taken a stand that is aligned with its own interests instead of viewing them from others' lenses. India respectfully agrees to disagree with the consensus of the lobbies.